enthusiastic crowds greeted the Führer as he annexed Austria and made it part of the Third Reich. But Hitler had another very personal agenda. Once Austria belonged to Hitler, he took steps to eradicate any suspicion of his Jewish past.
One thing Hitler, from the very beginning, sought to do was to cover up the evidence of his past. And so, by doing so, he caused a lot of rumors and myths to be projected upon the blank space of the past that he tried to erase.
Like Stalin erasing photographs, Hitler eradicated the Austrian village of Dollersheim and a dark secret that had haunted him for years. The birth registry of Dollersheim held the birth certificate of his father, who Hitler suspected was the illegitimate son of a Jew. Hitler used the village as an artillery range. Round after round of artillery fire crashed into the village, demolishing its buildings and making the graves in the cemetery unrecognizable.
You come upon this sort of ruined church with just some hollow walls standing, and it seemed to me in some way a metaphor for the ruin of the absence, the vacancy of the historical record on Hitler's past.
By obliterating the town, Hitler erased suspicion of his own Jewish blood. Like Stalin, Hitler believed he was surrounded by enemies trying to betray him, and that he needed to strike first.
Hitler grew up with the idea from his experience in his own family that it was probably necessary to kill if one did not want to be killed. He generalized this and divided people into predators and victims, and chose very deliberately to be a predator.
The predator's next victims would be Jews. Hitler's obsession and secret plan would be to liquidate all the Jews of Germany, Europe, and the Soviet Union under the cover of war. Hitler's secret agenda had always been to attack Russia. Now he was ready. To lull Stalin to sleep and give him a false sense of security, Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union in June 1939. The two most powerful dictators in the world became allies. Stalin, ironically, felt secure. On the morning of June the 22nd, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia. For Hitler, it would fulfill two goals: the destruction of Bolshevism and the annihilation of the Jews. The invasion stunned Stalin, and not surprisingly, he felt personally betrayed.
It was a total surprise to Stalin, and he was very disoriented as a result, and for the next several weeks he went into a kind of nervous breakdown, and people had difficulty contacting him, getting him to understand what was happening, and it wasn't for about 3 or 4 weeks that he finally pulled himself together and started acting like the man he was supposed to be.
For the paper today, all are eager to read the speech of Stalin. Stalin calls upon the Soviet people to grapple in deadly conflict with its most vicious, most treacherous enemy.
In late 1941, Operation Barbarossa appeared to be a smashing success. Hitler was jubilant. But Providence did not favor the Führer, and ironically, the beginning of the end came 15 months later in a city called Stalingrad. Here, the symbolic showdown between two men of iron came to a head. In September 1942, the Germans launched an all-out land and air attack on Stalingrad. Stalin issued an order. Any soldier that surrendered would be considered a traitor. Retreating soldiers were shot.
If they were commanding officers, the family members should be subject to repression. As it turned out, he himself had a family member who was an officer, and this was his son, Yakov.
Stalin's son, Yakov, had joined the army and was taken prisoner by the Germans.
At one point, the Germans may have thought they could offer to exchange Yakov for some high-level German officers who had been taken prisoner by the Russians. And some kind of a offer was made, to which Stalin is believed to have said, "I have no son named Yakov."
The Russians held on and launched a massive counterattack of 1 million men, encircling the German 6th Army. In 1943, Hitler was defeated at Stalingrad, and the German army would never recover on the Eastern Front. But even though Hitler was losing the war, he was still determined to exterminate the Jews.
When things were hanging precariously in the balance on the Eastern Front, Hitler, given the choice between allocating troops and trains to reinforce the German armies fighting off the assault of Stalin's Red Army and allocating those troops and trains to carrying Jews to the death camps, Hitler withdrew troops and trains from the Eastern Front in order to more swiftly and efficiently carry out the murder of the Jews.
By now, in 1943, Hitler was a very sick man. After his defeat at Stalingrad, Hitler became increasingly dependent on amphetamines. Each morning, his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, gave him an injection. Throughout the day, Hitler treated himself with oral amphetamines. At night, he took barbiturates to sleep. As the war went on, the Führer became more and more dependent on Dr. Morell. New information obtained from Hitler's medical records reveals that he showed signs of drug toxicity, which affected his judgment. He became increasingly more paranoid. Towards the end of the war, Hitler began to show symptoms of Parkinson's disease.
Wenn man täglich mit zusammen ist, da fällt das nicht so auf.
He trembled slightly, but if you are with someone every day, you don't notice this. And no one paid attention to every detail.
Das hat man schon gemerkt.
As the Red Army overwhelmed Berlin, Hitler was hiding deep inside the Führer bunker beneath the Chancellery. When Russian soldiers entered the bunker, they found several Nazi corpses amidst signs of an orgy. In the courtyard were the charred bodies of Eva Braun and Hitler. Inside, on the Führer's desk, the Russians found a folder with 42 of Hitler's paintings of pastoral Austria and an album of prized snapshots. Inside, a photo Hitler had been carrying with him all his life of his mother Clara. Stalin, the final victor, exploited his triumph over the Nazis by parading long lines of Nazi war prisoners through Red Square to rally the Soviet people. Many had hoped the man of steel had softened.
I remember I, at the time, was an attaché of the American Embassy. And on May 9, 1945, the day the surrender took place, there was a great burst of rejoicing on the streets of Moscow. People were dancing, and I remember standing in a group in which one young officer, perhaps a major, said in Russian, "Now it's time to live."
But Stalin, as usual, needed enemies, not peace and freedom. The terror this time was directed against Jews. It centered on a group of Jewish doctors Stalin accused of plotting to murder Soviet leaders, including Stalin himself.
The accused doctors were to be publicly executed on Red Square. And following that, the Jewish population of the major cities were to be deported to eastern Siberia, with pogroms perpetrated against him en route.
Only his sudden death on March the 5th, 1953, of a cerebral hemorrhage prevented him from carrying out yet another purge. His daughter, Svetlana, recalled the scene as she stood by his deathbed.
He suddenly opened his eyes and cast a glance over everyone in the room. It was a terrible glance. Then something incomprehensible and awesome happened. He suddenly lifted his left hand as though he were pointing to something above and bringing down a curse on all of us. The next moment, after a final effort, the spirit wrenched itself free of the flesh.
Hundreds of thousands of mourners watched as Stalin was laid to rest in the mausoleum beside Lenin. For Adolf Hitler, there was no monument, not even a marker.